I didn't hear my father cry until he asked the question. Not shouted, not angry, just quiet, unsteady, almost afraid. How did this happen? For a moment, I didn't answer. I stood in the doorway of my childhood home, my coat still on my bag by my feet, listening to a man I'd known all my life finally sound like he didn't know what to do. The house smelled the same old pine cleaner coffee that had sat too long on the burner, but everything else felt off like a picture hung slightly crooked. His hands were shaking. Mine were not. 3 months earlier, I hadn't been invited home for Christmas. That was where it really began. Christmas has always been loud in my family. Too loud sometimes. The television on, my father clearing his throat before saying, "Grace," my mother fussing over dishes. No one ever noticed. Even when I joined the Navy, even when I moved farther away, Christmas was the one thing that didn't change. A call, a plan, a place at the table. That year, I waited. I was in my apartment near the base, a small place with beige walls and furniture that had followed me through 2 moves. Outside the parking lot, lights flickered on as the sky darkened, early winter settling in. I checked my phone more times than I care to admit, telling myself I was just passing time. Finally, my father called. He didn't ask where I'd be for Christmas. He didn't say they missed me. He cleared his throat and said, "We figured you were busy with work." That was it. They said I was busy with work. I would repeat later. Because that's exactly how it sounded, as if they had already decided for me. As if my life was something they could summarize in a sentence and move on from. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Years in uniform had taught me that not every silence was surrender. Sometimes it was restraint. "All right," I said finally. "I understand." We hung up. No plans were made. No dates were discussed. Christmas passed without my name being mentioned again. On Christmas Eve, I worked a late shift. The base was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone else is home. Someone had taped paper snowflakes to the break room window. A radio played old carols too softly to be cheerful. I ate a reheated meal from a plastic container and thought about how strange it was to miss something you hadn't been allowed to want. I didn't tell my parents how that felt. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call afterward to say I was hurt. I stayed silent because silence had always been my role. I was the one who could handle things, the dependable one, the one who didn't need fussing over. January came, then February. Life didn't pause because my family had. I worked, I trained, I slept when I could. There were long days and short nights, routine and responsibility filling the spaces where resentment might have grown. I told myself that families made assumptions that they didn't always realize the weight of what they said or didn't say. Then came the call in March. My father's name lit up my phone mid-afternoon. I almost didn't answer. Not out of anger, but out of instinct. Something in my chest tightened before I even picked up. His voice was different, thinner, rushed. "Are you free to talk?" he asked. I stepped outside the spring air, cool but promising, and leaned against the building. "What's going on?" There was a pause, papers shuffled. Someone else murmured in the background, "My mother," I guessed. "We could use your help," he said. Things got complicated. That was when I agreed to come home. Standing there now 3 months after Christmas, I finally saw the cost of those assumptions. The house looked smaller than I remembered. My father looked older. The confidence he wore so easily when I was growing up had cracked just enough to let uncertainty show through. "I don't understand how it went so wrong," he said again, his voice breaking. "How did this happen?" I took off my coat, slowly hung it on the same hook it had always been on. The hallway photos still showed me in various stages of childhood soccer uniforms. Awkward school pictures ending long before my adult life began. No photos of my time in the Navy. No reminders of who I had become. I thought of Christmas night, of sitting alone with a mug of coffee gone cold watching snow fall outside my window. Of how easily they had decided I wasn't coming, of how quiet I had been. "This didn't happen all at once," I said carefully. "It happened over time." He looked at me, then really looked as if noticing something new. Maybe it was the way I stood. Maybe it was the steadiness in my voice. Or maybe it was simply the realization that the daughter he thought he knew had been living a life he'd never bothered to ask about. That was the moment I understood something important. Silence doesn't erase consequences. It only delays them. And this shaking voice, this question he couldn't answer was the reckoning he never expected to face. Silence has a reputation for being weak. People think if you don't speak up, you're being pushed aside. But that's not how I learned it. In the Navy, silence can be discipline. It can be patience. It can be the space where you decide whether something is worth responding to at all. Growing up, I was the quiet one, not shy, just observant. I watched how things worked in our house. My father made decisions quickly and expected them to stand. My mother smoothed over the rough edges, filling gaps with excuses and good intentions. And my brother, my younger brother, never had to wait for an invitation. He was simply assumed. If someone needed help fixing a fence, they called him. If there was a family dinner, his schedule was checked first. If something went wrong, it was explained away as he didn't know better. I was the one they trusted to manage on my own. She's strong, my father used to say. She doesn't need us hovering. At first, I wore that like a compliment. Independence felt like freedom. I left for college, then officer training. Then my first assignment, learning how to stand on my own 2 feet in ways my parents never had. Distance made things simpler. Calls became shorter. Visits less frequent. No one thought about it. No one questioned it either. By the time Christmas came that year, the pattern was already set. They didn't ask if I was coming. They decided I was busy. And when I didn't object, the decision became permanent. People my age and older understand this kind of family math. The child who causes the least trouble often ends up carrying the most weight. You don't notice it while it's happening. You just keep showing up, keep adapting until one day you realize no one is checking whether you want to anymore. In January, after the holidays passed, my mother sent a card, a snowy scene, a short message. Hope work is going well. We missed you. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been left unsaid. Just a gentle layer of sentiment over something sharp. I read it once, then set it on the counter, and went back to my routine. Early mornings, long hours, the familiar comfort of order and expectation. On base, I knew exactly where I stood. Rank, responsibility, clarity. At home, everything had always been assumed. That was the difference. When March arrived and my father called asking for help, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger either. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired in the way you feel when you've been holding something heavy for a long time without realizing it. That night, after unpacking in my old room, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The walls creaked the way they always had. The clock in the hallway still ticked too loudly. I remembered lying there as a teenager, staring at the ceiling, already planning my way out. Back then, I thought leaving meant escape. Now I understood it had also meant being forgotten. In the morning, my father sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, financial statements, letters, official-looking envelopes he clearly didn't understand. He looked up when I came in, relief flashing across his face before he caught himself. "I'm glad you're here," he said. I nodded. "Tell me what happened." He launched into explanations, missed deadlines, assumptions, made conversations he thought he didn't need to have. Each sentence sounded familiar. Not the details, but the tone. The same confidence that had once filled the house was now fraying at the edges. As he spoke, I realized something else. My silence at Christmas hadn't just been personal. It had reinforced a pattern. By not correcting them, I had allowed them to continue deciding for me. And by doing that, I had stayed in a role I'd outgrown. That didn't mean the silence was wrong. It meant it was incomplete. "I didn't know it was this serious," my mother said quietly, standing at the sink. "If we had known." I stopped her gently. "You could have asked." The room went still, not tense, just quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet where something lands and doesn't immediately get brushed aside. My father looked down at his hands. "We didn't think you'd want to be bothered," he said. "You always seem so busy, so capable." There it was again, the compliment that doubled his distance. "I am capable," I said. "That doesn't mean I don't want to be included." He didn't respond right away. He stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into an easier answer. Later that afternoon, while helping sort through documents, I noticed a small thing. A calendar on the wall still turned to December. Christmas circled in red. Next to it, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, just the three of us. They hadn't meant to hurt me. That was the truth. But they had meant to simplify. And in simplifying, they had erased me. That evening, my father sat across from me in the living room, the same chair he'd always claimed as his. He cleared his throat. A habit as old as I was. You didn't say anything, he said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. At Christmas. No, I agreed. I didn't. I thought that meant you didn't mind. I met his eyes. It meant I didn't think you were listening. The words hung there heavier than anything I'd said so far. He swallowed hard. I saw then that this wasn't just about paperwork or problems. It was about a man realizing that quiet strength had costs he'd never calculated. Silence isn't weakness, but it isn't communication either. And when you confuse the two, you build a life on assumptions that eventually collapse. That was the lesson beginning to take shape between us, even if neither of us was ready to say it out loud yet. March has a way of pretending everything is normal. The snow melts just enough to reveal old grass and forgotten debris. People start talking about spring as if winter didn't leave marks. That was the month my father finally admitted things weren't fine. The morning after our kitchen conversation, he asked me to drive with him into town. He said he wanted to show me a few things, which was his way of easing into a subject he didn't fully understand. We rode in silence at first, the familiar roads feeling narrower than I remembered. The diner on Main Street was still there. The hardware store, too. Everything looked the same, which made it harder to accept how much had shifted underneath. He parked outside a small brick building I hadn't paid much attention to growing up. A law office. His hands hesitated on the steering wheel before he opened the door. I should have handled this months ago, he said as we walked in. I just didn't think it would turn into what it did. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and furniture polish. We sat across from a man in his late 50s who spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they don't want to scare someone, but know they might have to. Missed deadlines, assumptions, documents signed without full understanding. Each explanation peeled back another layer of how far things had drifted. I listened, asked questions, took notes. It felt familiar. Briefings, assessments, problem solving. My father watched me the way you watch someone else take control of a situation you no longer can. Not resentful, just stunned. On the drive home, he didn't turn the radio on. He gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. I don't get it, he said finally. I thought we were doing everything right. I looked out the window at fields just beginning to thaw. You were doing what you'd always done, I said. That's not the same thing. He nodded slowly as if turning that over in his mind. Then almost to himself, he said it again. How did this happen? That question stayed with me the rest of the day. It wasn't just about legal trouble or paperwork. It was about a man realizing that familiarity can turn into blindness if you're not careful. That afternoon, I went through old files with my mother. She moved quietly, her hands precise, avoiding my eyes more than usual. I recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn whenever there was conflict growing up, focused on the task, hoping the tension would resolve itself without confrontation. You could have told us you were upset, she said softly, sliding a folder across the table. I could have, I agreed. But I've also been telling you for years, just not with words. She paused, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper. We didn't think it was that serious. That's the problem, I said. You didn't think that wasn't meant to be cruel. It was simply the truth. They had made decisions based on convenience, on habit, on the version of me they were comfortable remembering, not the one who had grown, changed, and learned to carry responsibility without being asked. Later, my brother stopped by. He greeted me like nothing had changed. Easy and casual. He talked about work, about the weather, about a new truck he was thinking of buying. He didn't mention Christmas. He didn't mention the phone calls or the silence. He assumed, as always, that everything would settle around him. At one point, he laughed and said, "Dad said you're the one fixing all this." I looked at him. "I'm not fixing it," I said. "I'm helping understand it." He shrugged, unconcerned. Same thing. That was when it hit me. For him, things had always been handled by my parents, by circumstance, by someone else stepping in. For me, Stepping in had become second nature, but that didn't mean it was my obligation. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. I thought about Christmas again, not with bitterness, but with clarity, about how easy it had been for them to say I was busy. How simple it was to leave me out once they'd convinced themselves it made sense. 3 months. That was all it took for those assumptions to unravel. The next morning, my father asked me to walk with him. We went out back, the ground soft under our feet. He stopped near the old fence line, the one he'd always meant to replace. "I never thought not inviting you would matter this much," he said. "I didn't think it would lead here." I looked at the fence, at the leaning posts and broken boards. "It didn't start with Christmas," I said. That was just the moment it became visible. He exhaled slowly, the sound rough. "I didn't know you felt so far away." I turned to him then. "You didn't ask." He nodded once. No defense, no excuse, just acknowledgement. It wasn't an apology yet, but it was closer than we'd ever been. That was when I understood something else. This wasn't a story about revenge in the way people usually mean it. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no dramatic victory. The reckoning was quieter, more personal. Watching someone you love realize that their certainty had costs, and that those costs had names. Mine was one of them. And his question, "How did this happen?" was no longer something I needed to answer alone. There's a moment in every family crisis when the questions shift. They stop being about what went wrong and start becoming about what was missed. That was the moment we reached next. The paperwork on the dining table had been sorted into neat stacks by then. Deadlines circled, notes scribbled in the margins. My parents kept glancing at me as if waiting for a verdict I hadn't given. They still thought the problem was the problem. They didn't yet see the larger absence underneath it. "You seem to understand all this," my father said late one afternoon. "More than we do." I didn't answer right away. I was reading a letter from an agency he hadn't even realized he'd been corresponding with. The language was careful, legal, final in tone. It wasn't threatening. It was worse than that. It assumed compliance. "I understand it," I said finally, "because I've been trained to read what people don't say." That puzzled him. "What do you mean?" I set the paper down. "This letter assumes you won't push back, that you won't ask questions, that you'll accept the version of events they've decided for you." My mother frowned. "Why would they think that?" I looked up at her. "Because it's what you've always done." The room went quiet again. Not the awkward kind this time, the thoughtful kind. It wasn't that my parents were careless. They paid their bills. They showed up for work. They raised 2 children who didn't end up in trouble. But they had relied on familiarity instead of curiosity, on habit instead of attention. They assumed things would continue because they always had. That's what they hadn't known about me. While they were assuming I was busy with work, I had been learning how systems fail, how small decisions compound, how silence from one side is often interpreted as consent by the other. In the Navy, you don't get the luxury of assuming things will work themselves out. You learn to anticipate, to verify, to ask the question before it becomes a crisis. They had never seen that side of my life. That evening, my father asked if I wanted to go through the garage with him. It was his way of doing something physical when his thoughts got too heavy. We moved boxes, sorted tools, dust rising in the slanted light. Halfway through, he stopped and leaned on a workbench. "You never told us much about what you do," he said. "You never asked much," I replied gently. He nodded. "I guess I figured if you needed us, you'd say something." That assumption again, the belief that strength announces itself when it's tired. "I didn't need you to fix anything," I said. "I needed you to remember I was still part of the family." He swallowed. I saw his jaw tighten the way it always had when he was trying to hold something back. Later that night, after my parents went to bed, I reviewed everything on my laptop. Policies, timelines, options. Not because I enjoyed control, but because clarity had always been my anchor. As I worked, I realized how invisible this part of my life had been to them. They still thought of my job as something abstract work, something that kept me busy, but didn't shape who I was. They didn't know about the responsibility, the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone, the way you learn to stay calm when everyone else is panicking. And they certainly didn't know how much of that discipline had come from learning early on not to expect emotional backup. The next day, my father asked if we could talk alone. We sat on the back porch, the late afternoon sun warming the boards beneath our feet. "You always seemed fine," he said. "Even when you were younger, you didn't complain. You didn't ask for much." "I learned early that not asking made things easier," I said. "For us," he corrected quietly. I nodded. "Yes." He leaned back, staring out at the yard. I didn't realize how much we leaned on that. That was the thing they hadn't known. My quiet wasn't proof that everything was okay. It was a skill, one I'd learned to survive being overlooked without becoming bitter. When Christmas came and they decided I was busy, that skill had kicked in automatically. Stay composed. Don't escalate. Accept the situation and move forward. It worked in my career. It just didn't work in a family that mistook endurance for distance. "I can help you sort this out," I told him, "but I need something first." He turned to me. "What?" "I need you to stop assuming you know what I can handle," I said. "And start asking." He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded slowly, deliberately. "All right." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a promise wrapped in emotion, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt like we were standing on the same side of the problem instead of opposite sides of a misunderstanding. That night, lying in my old bed, I thought again about the question he'd asked when I arrived. How did this happen? The answer was clearer now. It happened because they never saw the work behind my silence, the experience, the strength they took for granted, the life they assumed didn't need space at their table. They hadn't known, and I hadn't shown them. But knowing doesn't change the past. It only gives you a chance to change what comes next. We didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything else. When people imagine a confrontation, they expect raised voices, slammed doors, someone storming off to prove a point. But this wasn't that kind of reckoning. It was quieter, slower, the kind that settles into your bones instead of exploding outward. It began over breakfast. My father poured coffee into his chipped blue mug, the one he'd had for years, and set it down carefully. My mother moved between the stove and the counter, avoiding both of us in the way she always had when tension hovered nearby. "I've been thinking about what you said." My father began staring into his cup about us deciding things for you. I waited. In my line of work, silence is often more effective than interruption. He cleared his throat. "I didn't mean to push you out." "I know," I said, "but intent doesn't change impact." That stopped him. He looked up, really looked as if hearing me instead of the echo of his own assumptions. "You're right," he said quietly. "I guess I never asked myself how it felt from your side." That was the opening. Not a dramatic one, but a real one. "I'll tell you," I said, "but I'm not going to raise my voice to do it." We moved to the living room, the same space where I'd sat through countless family conversations growing up, always listening, rarely steering. My father sat across from me, hands folded, waiting. That alone told me something had shifted. "When you said I was busy with work," I began. "You didn't just explain my absence. You justified it. You decided it made sense for me not to be there." My mother sat down, then, her face drawn, but attentive. "I didn't think you'd want to come home just to sit around," she said. "You've always had more going on." I nodded. "I do, but that doesn't mean I don't want a place." My father exhaled slowly. "We didn't think of it that way." "I know." I said again, "That's the problem." There was no accusation in my voice, just fact. Years of learning to speak plainly when stakes were high had taught me that tone mattered as much as words. "You've always decided what I can handle," I continued. "You did it when I was younger, and you never stopped. You decided I was strong enough to be overlooked." My father's jaw tightened. I'm not saying you meant harm," I said, holding up a hand. "I'm saying harm doesn't always need intention." That landed. I could see it in his eyes, the way the idea settled in and refused to be brushed aside. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. Ordinary sounds carrying a conversation that felt anything but. "I thought giving you space was respect," he said finally. "Sometimes it is," I replied. "But space without invitation feels like absence." My mother wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. "We never wanted you to feel like you didn't belong." "I didn't feel like I didn't belong," I said. "I felt like I wasn't expected." That distinction mattered. Belonging is internal. Expectation is external. And for years, I had learned to live without the latter. We talked for hours about small things that had piled up, about missed calls that never got returned because no one followed up, about how my brother's life had always felt closer, easier to manage, and how convenience had quietly become priority. My brother wasn't there for this conversation. That was intentional. This wasn't about him. It was about the structure my parents had built without noticing who it left out. At one point, my father stood and walked to the window, staring out at the yard. I didn't realize how much I assumed he said. I thought I was being practical. Practicality without empathy can be cold, I said gently. He nodded. I see that now. There were moments when his voice wavered. When mine did too. But no one shouted. No one stormed out. We stayed seated facing each other because this wasn't a fight. It was an accounting. By evening, we were drained. My father looked older than he had that morning, as if understanding had taken something out of him. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I leaned back, feeling the weight of the day settle. You don't fix it all at once. You start by asking instead of deciding, he nodded. And Christmas. That's not the real issue, I said. It was just the moment everything else became obvious. He swallowed hard. I wish I could take it back. I don't need you to, I said. I need you to remember it. That night, I lay awake again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't sharp. It was reflective, like the pause after something important has finally been said. Confrontation doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like honesty delivered without cruelty. Sometimes it's two people sitting across from each other finally willing to see what they've both been avoiding. And sometimes the hardest part isn't saying how you were hurt. It's being heard without anyone trying to argue you out of it. The consequences didn't announce themselves with drama. They arrived quietly like overdue bills slipped under a door. Once the emotional dust settled, reality stepped back in. Deadlines still existed. Letters still required answers. Problems didn't care that we'd finally talked about feelings. They just waited. That was when my father truly understood what had been at stake. 2 days after our long conversation, a certified letter arrived. He held it like it might burn him, turning it over in his hands before opening it. His shoulders sagged as he read. They're moving forward, he said, even after everything we sent. I read it over his shoulder. The language was firm now, less patient. It made one thing clear: choices had been made on his behalf because he hadn't made them himself. This could have been stopped earlier, I said, not accusing, just stating fact. I know, he replied. His voice was flat. I know. That was the reckoning, not punishment, not humiliation. The simple realization that inaction carries weight and assumptions don't protect you from consequences. We spent the next several days working side by side. I made calls. I drafted responses. I explained processes my parents had never needed to understand before. Each step revealed how exposed they'd been without realizing it. At one point, my father looked at me and said, "You do this kind of thing all the time, don't you?" "Yes," I said, "just not for myself." That seemed to hit him harder than anything else I'd said. He watched how I stayed calm when conversations turned tense. How I didn't raise my voice when someone pushed back. How I listened more than I spoke. This wasn't bravado. It was training, experience, a way of moving through problems without letting them control you. "I thought your work was just long hours," my mother admitted quietly one night. "I didn't realize it was like this." "It is," I said. "And it teaches you something important." "What's that?" she asked. "That ignoring small things doesn't make them go away," I said. "It just makes them harder to handle later." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. When we finally reached a point where the damage could be limited, where the worst outcomes were avoided, my father sank into his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "If you hadn't come," he said, his voice thick, "I don't know what we would have done." I didn't respond right away. Gratitude can be complicated when it arrives tangled with regret. "I would have helped eventually," I said. "Because you're my parents. But it shouldn't take a crisis for that to happen." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." That evening, he poured himself a drink and sat alone at the kitchen table. I joined him, not saying anything at first. We listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet settling of the house. I keep thinking about Christmas, he said finally, about how easy it was to say you were busy. I looked at him. Easy doesn't mean harmless. I know, he said. And I keep wondering, if you hadn't been who you are, if you hadn't learned to manage things on your own, would this have turned out worse? Yes, I said honestly, it would have. He closed his eyes. That's a hard thing to sit with. It is, I agreed. That was the moment his earlier question returned heavier now. How did this happen? The answer wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. Years of assuming resilience meant absence. Years of choosing convenience over curiosity. I didn't lose you, he said suddenly. But I came close. I didn't soften that truth for him. He needed to feel it. Not to suffer, but to understand. Reckonings don't always come with villains. Sometimes they come with mirrors. By the end of the week, things were stable, not perfect. Stable. My parents were tired, but relieved. I was exhausted in a deeper way, the kind that comes from carrying both responsibility and emotion at once. On my last night before heading back, my father stood at the door of my room. I don't want us to go back to how things were, he said. I don't want to assume anymore. Then don't, I replied. Ask even when it feels unnecessary. He nodded. I will. It wasn't a dramatic promise. It didn't fix the past, but it acknowledged the cost of ignoring the present. As I packed, I thought about revenge, about how stories like this are often framed as payback, as triumph. But nothing about this felt victorious. It felt sobering. The reckoning wasn't about proving my worth. It was about watching someone realize they had underestimated the price of their certainty. And that realization, quiet, unavoidable, deeply personal, was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. The question came back to him when the house was quiet again. Not the rushed, panicked version he'd asked when I first arrived. This one was slower, heavier, the kind of question that isn't looking for a quick answer. It was my last morning before heading back. The sun had just come up, pale and careful, lighting the kitchen the way it always had. My father sat at the table, both hands wrapped around his coffee, staring into it as if it might explain something if you waited long enough. I keep replaying it, he said without looking up. All of it. I sat across from him. What part? Christmas, he said. And before that, and after. He shook his head. How did this happen to us? That was different. The question had changed shape. It wasn't about paperwork anymore. It wasn't even about decisions. It was about distance. I thought carefully before answering. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because answers like this deserved care. It happened because we stopped checking in. I said, you checked boxes instead. Holidays, calls, assumptions. You thought that was enough. He winced just slightly, and it wasn't. No, I said it wasn't. He looked up at me, then eyes tired, older than I remembered. I thought being a good father meant making sure you were okay without needing us. That's part of it, I said, but another part is letting your child decide when they want you. He nodded slowly. I didn't leave you room for that. No, I said you didn't. There was no bitterness in my voice. That surprised even me. The anger had burned out days earlier, replaced by something steadier. Understanding doesn't erase hurt, but it does change how you carry it. I didn't stop coming home because of Christmas, I continued. I stopped expecting to be asked. That landed harder than I intended. He pressed his lips together, breathing through it. I thought you preferred it that way, he said. I adapted to it that way, I replied. There's a difference. For a long time, we just sat there. The house creaked. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started up. Life continuing indifferent to personal revelations. I'm sorry, he said finally. It wasn't dramatic. No qualifiers, no explanations, just those two words. I nodded. Thank you. He let out a breath he'd been holding. I don't know how to undo what I missed. You don't undo it, I said. You acknowledge it, and you do better going forward. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. I wish I'd asked more questions. So do I said. But wishing doesn't change things. Asking does. Before I left, my mother hugged me longer than usual. She didn't say much, she never did in moments like these, but she squeezed my hand and whispered, "We'll try harder." That was enough. As I packed my car, my father stood on the porch, hands in his pockets. He looked uncertain, like someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Call me when you get back," he said. "And if you're busy, just tell me. Don't disappear." I smiled faintly. "I won't." The drive back felt lighter than the drive in. Not because everything was fixed, but because it no longer felt invisible. The silence between us had been named. That mattered. Back at my apartment, I unpacked slowly, settling back into routines that felt both familiar and slightly altered. Work resumed. Life continued. But something had shifted beneath it all. A week later, my father called not to ask for help, not because something was wrong, but just to talk. He asked how my week had been. He listened to the answer. That was new. We didn't become close overnight. We didn't suddenly know everything about each other. But the space between us felt different, intentional, now not assumed. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't look like a reunion. Sometimes it looks like small, deliberate changes that say, "I see you." Now, when I thought back to Christmas, to the night, I sat alone and told myself it didn't matter. I understood something I hadn't then. Silence can protect you, but connection requires risk from both sides. My father had finally taken that risk, and so had I. The next Christmas didn't arrive with trumpets or grand promises. It came the way most meaningful things do, quietly, with intention. I knew something was different when my father called in early December. Not to inform me of plans, not to explain what he thought I could or couldn't manage, just to ask. "Do you think you'll be able to come home this year?" he said. "If not, we can figure something else out." There it was, an invitation, not wrapped in assumption, not softened by excuses, just an open door. "I'd like to," I said, and I meant it. When I pulled into the driveway a few weeks later, the house looked the same. Same siding, same porch light, same old wreath hanging a little crooked on the door. But the feeling was different. Not warmer exactly, more honest. Inside, my mother was finishing dinner. My father stood back, unsure whether to step forward or give me space. I set my bag down and smiled. "I'm home," I said. He smiled back, tentative, but real. "We're glad you're here." That was it. No speeches, no emotional flood, just words that had been missing before. Christmas Day itself was simple. No big crowd, no forced cheer. We ate, we talked. There were pauses, but they weren't uncomfortable. They were the kind that happen when people are thinking instead of filling space. At one point, my father handed me a small wrapped box. "It's not much," he said. Inside was an old photo I hadn't seen in years. Me standing awkwardly in uniform at the start of my career. My parents on either side of me. He'd had it reframed. I realized he said quietly that we stopped adding new pictures. I swallowed. "Thank you." Later that afternoon, he asked about my work. Not in a vague way. He asked what my days were like, what parts were hardest, what parts mattered most. And when I answered, he listened. Really listened. No nodding along. No quick conclusions. That evening, after dinner was cleared and the house settled, we sat together in the living room. The same room where so much had gone unsaid for years. "I don't ever want to decide your life for you again," my father said. "Even when I think I'm helping." "I don't expect perfection," I told him. "Just presence," he nodded. "That I can do." Reconciliation isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about choosing to acknowledge what did and not repeating it. As I drove back after the holidays, I thought about the story I could have told, the louder one. The version where exclusion is met with revenge, where silence is replaced by spectacle. But that wasn't the truth of this experience. The real reckoning wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. My father's voice had shaken, not because he'd lost control, but because he'd finally understood what he stood to lose. And that understanding changed him more than anger ever could have. For those listening who are parents, there's something I hope you take with you. Don't assume silence means everything is fine. Don't decide for your adult children what they can handle or what they want. Ask, invite, listen. And for those who are children grown or not, remember this, your quiet strength is real. But you're allowed to ask for a place at the table. Families don't fall apart because of one missed holiday. They fracture because of the small moments when someone stops being asked and starts being assumed. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone you haven't called or a conversation you've been avoiding, I invite you to pause and reflect. Maybe even reach out. And if you believe stories like this matter, that they help us see each other more clearly, consider sharing it or subscribing for more. Sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.